Next is James Compton, who's a doctoral student at the University of Montana, specializing in modern American political, diplomatic, and military history. A retired Marine Corps officer, he is a 1999 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and Compton is originally from Havre, Montana. So, Havre has it.
Havre has it. That's right. I'm not sure I most elegantly applied this, but yes, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here and great to follow. This is a tough act to follow, but I will do my best. And I've titled this Controversy in Great Falls, the Montana's Native Americans and the Politics of Conscription from 1940 to 41. I think you'll see it'll build onto some of the themes both presented this morning and also from yesterday's presentation by Mr. Latreille. So, as the sun came up on October 16th, 1940, it was a crisp 34 degrees in Harlem, Montana. Earlier that week, the temperature had dipped below freezing and frosted the windshields along the Milk River Valley for the first time that season. And at locations across the small town of nearly 1,200 residents, workers prepared offices to open promptly at 7 o'clock. And while much of that would have been not unusual or typical for the fall day in Montana of the period, this day was quite extraordinary. October 16th was the first peacetime conscription day in American history. And the conscription law itself had been controversial throughout the election year summer. Here you see Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Senator James E. Murray, both of them voted against this. The letters in their archives show that Montana residents were about 9-1 against it. Of course, Jeanette Rankin there, the famous pacifist who had sort of come back into the political stage in 1940. And there was no accident she emerged back onto the scene here. All of this had to do with the anxiety over entry into the European War, what they understood to be the European War at that time. But on this day in Harlem, there were no visible signs of protest. Local officials opened up 2 precincts, remained open for 14 hours. And sometime around noon, 25-year-old Joe Longknife made his way from the Fort Belknap Reservation to the East Harlem station to register. A Nakota or Assiniboine tribal member, Longknife was one of 339 local men, aged 21 to 35, who registered as required by the new law. And unlike conscription for World War I in 1917, the 1940 law was the first to require Native Americans to register as citizens. In some Native communities, this was a moment for protest, but not for Longknife or any of Montana's federally recognized tribes. And over the next 2 weeks, he waited to see if his number, 399, which you can see kind of in the upper left-hand portion here of his draft card, would be drawn in the national lottery, and it wasn't. But somewhere in late January 1941, he took matters into his own hands. He enlisted into the Army. And he would soon see some of the most difficult combat of the Pacific War at a place we've all heard of, the notorious Bataan. And today I will argue that the Selective Service Act of 1940 created a new theater, conscription, in which myriad Native Americans engaged in politics and performed their own ideas of citizenship on the eve of the Second World War. And to many, like Longknife, that meant choosing military service on their own terms. He joined over 16 million American men in registering for the draft as an obligation of citizenship. And like many of the 25,000 Native Americans who served during World War II, he volunteered. To others, however, conscription was a moment for dissent, meaning and they would put out ranging multiple different ways of challenging this, from the court of public opinion to various legal challenges. Some tribes contested the meaning of American citizenship and sought to preserve their own version of sovereignty. In South Florida, for example, 65 Seminole men defied the draft by fleeing into the Everglades. And near the Mexican border, an elderly Papago leader named Pia Machida refused to allow his people to register, violently resisted arrest, and led 25 draft-eligible men into hiding in the Sonoran Desert, where they remained at large for about 4 months. Closer to here, in nearby Washington State, a group of 71 Yakima men sued the federal government to prevent enforcement of the Selective Service Law based upon an 1855 treaty. and as, quote, alien residents who have not yet declared their intention to become citizens, quote. Similarly, in upstate New York, a group of Seneca, Mohawk, and Onondaga leaders objected to the force and coercion that conscription represented. They waited for a tribal member to be inducted and then filed a habeas corpus suit on behalf of his mother. And finally, right here in Great Falls, the president of the Montana Landless Indian Association initiated a media campaign that blurred the lines between official tribal governments and independent organizations in debates over the meaning of citizenship in the borderlands. And although they ultimately represented only a small number of groups, the geographical and tribal diversity created a public relations crisis for both John Collier's Indian office and for the tribal governments themselves. Here we have a picture of John Collier kind of standing in the middle here, right above Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, and then surrounding him is a delegation of Blackfeet who came to Washington, D.C. to advocate for their reservation and tribe. But Collier took special interest in this, and he countered these negative stories with celebrations of Native American patriotism, highlighting the volunteerism, the national service, the registration totals. But also tribal authority, as in who could and would speak on behalf of the tribe, was also contested. And as newly created entities by the Indian Reorganization Act, the tribal business committees asserted their voice as the legitimate representatives of their respective peoples and largely embraced their status as American citizens. So despite the well-publicized examples, one of which we'll go over today, of Indian resistance to the draft, these were in fact statistical outliers, and including right here in Montana. Now, you might never have heard of the controversy in Great Falls over peacetime conscription before, but believe it or not, it has gained some limited attention from scholars as an example of Native American draft resistance that generally lumps the Chippewa Crees together with the others. This morning, we'll learn how one savvy activist named Raymond Gray, pictured here, leveraged the moment to advocate for the plight of non-federally recognized indigenous peoples at the expense of the Chippewa Cree. This is, of course, the long story of the attempt to gain recognition for the Little Shell tribe. But I'm quite certain you've not heard about this other part of it because nobody really has ever written on it, to my knowledge, is how the Rocky Boy Business Committee at the moment fought back to protect the reputation of the Chippewa Cree in the court of American public opinion. Now, Raymond Gray here was well prepared for this moment based upon a life spent in political activism. He was born in Choteau, 1900, to Métis parents, and Gray quickly found himself into left-wing politics after graduating from high school there in 1918. As you can see here, in 1934, most of biographies of Gray don't really mention this portion, but he ran against Burton K. Wheeler in the 1934 Senate campaign as the Communist Party USA nominee. And he even led and went to several rallies here in Great Falls at the Eagles Hall, which I'll show you where that is in a second. And after a stint with the Teamsters in the late 30s, he was part of the Montana Landless Indians Associated Incorporated and served as its president. And so a week prior to National Registration Day for the draft, Gray announced a convention to be held here in Great Falls at the Eagles Hall. Now, the Eagles Hall, looking at this picture here, east down Central Avenue, from roughly where the Civic Center is, if you know where that is. Okay, we're talking about just a little bit further here and over here to the right, just on the far side of that Park Hotel. This picture was taken in December 1940, about 2 months after the time that we're talking about here this morning. Closer in look at this is called something called the Sanborn insurance maps. But the Eagles Club, you can see, was in about the 100 block of South 4th Street, just off of Central Avenue. And today, that's a parking garage, by the way. But anyway, Gray announced this convention here, and it was ostensibly to discuss remedial measures surrounding the Naturalization Act of 1918. The law complicated indigenous lives in the borderlands surrounding the Medicine Line. And as the storm clouds of war rapidly approached, the potential for deportation threatened to split apart Native families. The gathering, however, centered upon the broader meaning of citizenship itself. And here Gray asserted that, quote, Indians believed their rights to citizenship had been covered by previous treaties and that they could not be drafted. And Gray's timing was hardly a coincidence. His announcement was not only 1 week prior to this registration day for the draft, but also the same day that representatives of Montana's federally recognized tribes convened for something called the League of Nations of North American Indians in Billings. Shut out of a seat at the table there in Billings, Gray meant to establish both his own venue and to connect these two events in the public eye, which he was largely successful at doing, by the way. And on the Friday following the registration day, the Montana Indian Convention, as it was called, opened its 3-day program here at the Eagles Hall in Great Falls. And Gray, commensurate with his skillful promotion of the event, demonstrated a high degree of media savviness in ensuring that both the local Great Falls Tribune newspaper and also the wire services, the AP and United Press, broadcast his message into the court of American public opinion. The convention's opening was announced by the largest image on the front page of the October 18th Tribune. You can see here in front of you. Notice how this is situated beneath this internationally focused headline representing the sort of anxiety over world affairs at the moment. And of course, Gray himself is seated prominently here. Notice the symbolism of the moment. He's dressed in the business suit and shorter hair. He's sort of seen here editing the program. And then to the left of him, and also a very important part of the symbolism here, is a guy by the name of Francis Forsouls. This is, of course, the son of the famed Chief Little Bear. He's in traditional dress, braided hair, seen here gazing upon the program, as the quote was, in symbolic approval. But Forsouls, a Métis Cree person, was the living embodiment of the very problem set that Gray meant to highlight. Forsouls' father, Little Bear, pictured at right, had participated in the Northwest Rebellion we heard about a moment ago with Louis Riel, Canada in 1885. Later sought sanctuary in the United States and deported back to Canada in 1896. He was pardoned, soon returned back to Montana. And in the early part of the 20th century, Little Bear worked with Chippewa leader Rocky Boy to gain a reservation for the landless Chippewa and Cree peoples. In 1907, Forsouls, here pictured at left, was born in Montana, where he spent much of his youth on the newly established Rocky Boy Reservation, where his father would serve as its first chairman. Forsouls would follow his father into tribal government as one of the framers of the Rocky Boy Constitution in 1935. Served on the Business Committee from 1936 to 1937. But if his father's history was not reason enough to connect Forsouls to the issue of citizenship and deportation during wartime, his immediate family was. His wife, Mary, was a non-citizen born in Canada, while he and his 3 children were born here in the United States. Thus, Forsouls had personal reasons to participate in the conference beyond the larger macro-political issues. On the first day of the convention, Forsouls was given an opportunity to speak at the gathering, and Gray's purpose in highlighting Forsouls is made rather plain. What Forsouls actually said that day is uncertain. However, his name was firmly attached to many of Gray's talking points. In the public report about the summit, Forsouls noted that his father, Little Bear, had negotiated a peace treaty with the U.S. government in 1870 and had agreed to never again take up arms against a human being. This treaty also provided for dual U.S.-Canadian citizenship. But the explosive takeaway was captured by the subheadline of the main article. That was Chippewa Crees are exempt from draft. It was a bombshell claim that would soon reverberate across the country. Now, the record suggests that Forsouls had actually been widely misquoted. Forsouls' testimony before the Rocky Boy Business Committee shortly after that suggested a far different version of events than the newspaper had. Forsouls was explicit about his role in the public controversy. He told the committee of his peers that he, quote, didn't say anything about Rocky Boy or the Chippewa Crees not wanting to be drafted. The newspaper reporter, either misled by Gray or part of the potential ruse here, had clearly misquoted Forsouls. But moreover, Gray had not consulted with the recognized tribal authorities on the matter. But nevertheless, the damage was done. In the public eye, the Indians of north central Montana stood against conscription. And here we can see 4 examples. By the way, within 24 hours of this happening, This story had proliferated and gone viral all the way across the United States. These 4 examples are taken from newspapers in Texas and Massachusetts and Michigan and California. Within 24 hours, this appeared in more than 1,000 newspapers across the United States and in 4 Canadian provinces, giving you some idea about, we think viral is a new thing. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. But few of these widely printed wire services noted 4 souls by name, particularly the Associated Press version, the far more prolific one, but the United Press sort of did. But I would say that the Associated Press one was maybe even worse from the tribal perspective here, because 4 souls had morphed into, quote, representatives of the Chippewa Cree Indians. And the gathering was not an ad hoc assembly, but an annual Montana Indian Convention. So Gray's media savvy had succeeded here in effectively elevating a fringe meeting into an image of a widespread Indigenous resistance towards conscription. But far from using conscription as an issue to challenge citizenship, the actual representatives of Chippewa Cree embraced their martial obligations as citizens. The Business Committee met in special session on October 22nd, expressly to rebut Gray's article in the Great Falls Tribune. I'm not sure that they actually met here in the Rocky Boy Old Council Hall. This is a picture from about 1920. Probably not, but they certainly met on the Rocky Boy grounds. 35-year-old George Denny was the first to speak, and after explaining the contents of the article to the others, he argued that, quote, they should answer the statement in the paper because it represented a black eye to the tribe, and Mr. Gray's statement would hurt us. And while the public image of the tribe was one factor, maintaining the tribe's ward relationship to the federal government loomed large. The United States government would feel no obligations to us, Denny reasoned, if we felt that we didn't want to register. Denny, however, went well beyond financial considerations. He argued that, quote, we should stand up and defend our homes if there should ever be a war on this continent. To Denny, this extended well beyond reservation lands. Quote, we want the government to feel that we are ready anytime to defend our homes and country. And for Denny, this was not idle talk. Just 6 days earlier, the fit 6'2", 171-pound man had presented himself for the draft. Now, others on the committee similarly expressed concern for how Gray's article had misrepresented their position, and especially the potential consequences of that. James Denny noted that, quote, the way it sounds in the papers, it seems like they are taking us for slackers. Reflecting upon his perception of other tribes, how his own might look by comparison, he concluded that, quote, all of the other reservations are willing to register and fight for their country. And to Denny, the key point of emphasis was to, quote, have the people of Montana know that we are willing to register and have even had people that volunteered. Now, the 50-year-old James Denny then might not have been eligible for the draft, but his son William was. William had registered on October 16th, right alongside George and nearly 100 others. This is a picture of their family from 1920. William there is about 8 years old, so this is about 20 years into the future there. But the committee vowed to fight back, and also voted, I should say, to fight back in the court of public opinion. George Denny again led the way. He proposed a statement to be signed by the chairman and sent to the paper. Paul Mitchell, the 29-year-old secretary, was incensed that Gray had usurped tribal authority, and he saw a public statement as the only way to remedy the situation. Noting that this was certainly contrary, quote, contrary to the opinions of the tribe. And moreover, Gray had no political authority to speak on their behalf. According to Gray, quote, Gray should leave the Rocky Boy Indians out of his business entirely, unquote. That's according to Mitchell, I should say. But here again, members with the most at stake took the lead, ones who were eligible themselves to be conscripted. They took the formal parliamentary steps to initiate the official rebuttal. Mitchell made the motion, 30-year-old Pete Sadler seconded it. And the motion unanimously passed to send a statement to the Great Falls Tribune to be printed. And to solve the matter of funding, each member would personally donate 50 cents towards the effort. The statement, signed by Chairman Bill Morset and 4 souls, was printed in its entirety in the Great Falls Tribune. And to their credit somewhat, they did this free of charge. But you can see this here on October 24th, 1940. This is the verbatim statement. Quote, a statement was made to the Great Falls Tribune that the Chippewa Cree Indians did not want to register under the Selective Service Law and did not want to go to war. It is true that the Chippewa Cree Indians made a gentleman's agreement to some general that they would not take up arms against the white man, but we want to say that the Chippewa Cree Indians of the Rocky Boys Reservation are ready to defend our homes and country if any foreign nation tries to invade North America. We Indians want peace, but this does not mean that we will not defend our homes and country. We have some boys who volunteered and are in the Army now, and we have about 90 who registered and are ready to be called at any time for training. Unquote. Now, the unequivocal statement here bluntly set the record straight, at least locally. First, the business committee as chairman represented the legitimate voice of the tribe, thought they were squaring that away. And second, the Chippewa Cree were not only complying with the law and registering for the draft, but many had already volunteered here for military service. In fact, the committee's numbers of about 90 were actually conservative. In reality, 109 men from the Rocky Boy had registered. And furthermore, mirroring American public opinion of 1940, they stood ready to, quote, defend our homes and country against foreign invaders, quote, but they did not call for armed intervention overseas. In the context of the larger debate over intervention into the Second World War, the inclusion of the label North America was an unmistakable qualifier. The Great Falls Tribune did, again, print the resolution free of charge. They noted it was contrary to statements made by a convention here of Montana Indians. However, the impact of the retraction contrasted sharply with convention coverage. Instead of the front page, as we saw before, this is buried in the middle of page 12. And while we know at this time of year how important high school football is and whatnot, so maybe people would have looked at this page, and of course, it's a celebration of the Montana Grizzlies. We all know how important that is. But this is somewhat different, I think we'd all agree, than the front page coverage that the convention received. And this is even more a testament to sort of Gray's sort of media savvy, his ability to pull something like that off. His media partners, whoever they may be, they remain nameless. And of course, maybe more importantly, that this story isn't picked up anywhere except for right here on page 12 in Great Falls. So it's never printed anywhere else in the state, and certainly not picked up by the United Press or the United Press. So more or less, it's fixed locally, but as far as the national perception, that was never actually addressed. But despite the initial perception of widespread resistance to conscription from a multitude of tribal entities across the United States, this really constituted only a tiny fraction of Native Americans. The overwhelming supermajority of Indigenous Americans dutifully reported to register, stood for the draft, and volunteered. In Montana, the precise number is difficult to ascertain, but the Army records suggest around 1,370 during the war, adding in the Navy and the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and our numbers are about 1,600. And a closer look at the Rocky Boy Business Committee shows a similar pattern. Chairman Bill Morissette registered, later served in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Paul Mitchell later joined the Army, 1944. So while Collier's obvious propaganda and caricatured version of Indigenous service really did prove to be fairly close to the mark, as he put it, the first Americans were first in patriotism. But perhaps nobody embodied this more than Private First Class Joe Longknife. From our introduction, Longknife fought bravely in the desperate struggle on Bataan. His exploits were immortalized by correspondent Clark Lee in the March 9th, 1942 issue of Time magazine. Now, Clark stereotyped the Nakota Longknife as a, quote, able scout that as a youngster listened to tales of raiding parties from his father, Old Longknife, and his grandfather, Old Longknife. But caricatures aside, PFC Joe Longknife lived up to Plains warrior reputation in combat. On one patrol, he rose up out of the tall grass, killed 10 Japanese soldiers with 16 shots, and dispersed the rest with hand grenades. Member of Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion of the 31st Infantry, one of the only all-American infantry regiments in the Philippines at the time. He would endure sustained combat from December through April. His unit played a key role in repulsing the first Japanese offensive, buying critical time to stabilize the defense of Bataan and await the critical supplies and reinforcements from America that were planned to be sent, or what they thought was going to happen. But those supplies and reinforcements would never be sent. By the first week of April, Longknife and his fellow starving soldiers were under nearly constant attack from naval gunfire, artillery, aerial bombardment, and infantry attacks. By April 9th, he was one of only 160 soldiers remaining out of more than 1,800 in the regiment. The senior general in Bataan, realizing his hopeless position, surrendered the command later that day, and Joe Longknife was now a prisoner of war. This fight was far from over. These drawings, by the way, are also another Montana story drawn by Ben Steele, someone else who endured this. And later he wrote and penciled in some of these sketches at the time. Many of these were his recollections from later. He would endure, Joe Longknife and Ben Steele and others, the infamous and hellacious 65 miles known as the Bataan Death March. Somewhere between about 12,000 Americans began the trek north to Camp O'Connell, as depicted in the graphic there at the right, accompanied by about 66,000 Filipino soldiers. And Longknife and his comrades endured unspeakable cruelty. Many did not survive the journey, but he did. Camp O'Donnell's heinously and overcrowded and unsanitary conditions soon claimed more than 1,000 lives from torture and disease. But Longknife endured. Moving to Camp 1 in Cabana Tuan, that's this arrow here to the red triangle, if you will, in Luzon. Dysentery and malaria killed about 1,300 more Americans, but Longknife, again, stubbornly persisted. And sometime in late October, he and 1,000 American prisoners of war would be transferred by sea to the southern island of Mindanao and the Davao Penal Colony, which is down here at the very bottom center. No, their conditions did improve for Longknife and his fellow POWs. They regained some of their strength, but they were also put to hard labor for more than 2 years, working on Japanese airfields. But with MacArthur's return to the Philippines imminent, in the fall of 1944, Longknife and 750 others were loaded onto the Shinyo Maru at Zamboanga and bound for Manila and finally Japan when tragedy struck. The submarine USS Paddle detected a Japanese convoy near Shindagan Point, fired 4 torpedoes at 4:51 p.m. on September 7th. And the Shinyo Maru was fatally hit and soon slipped beneath the calm waters. It's possible that Longknife made it to the water. His numerous POWs were shot attempting to swim to shore. Only 82 POWs would survive. PFC Joseph Longknife, United States Army, however, did not. He remains missing to this day, 7,500 miles from home, and a stark example of the obligations of citizenship. Thank you.